Good morning, everyone. This is the California Air Quality in 2024 What You Need to webinar. No webinar. I'm James Westbrook, and I'm president of BlueScape Environmental, an air quality and environmental consulting firm based in Southern California. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Today's webinar will focus on what's happening in California air quality regulations and how those regulations might affect industrial and commercial interests in the state, including the federal rules that may apply in California as well as air district regulations. I'm joined here today by Peyton Wilson, who will deliver an update on the California regulations, especially those by the California Air Resources Board. We will look back at selected regulatory changes that affect us today as well as what's coming in 2024. In a short time, it's not possible to cover all of the regulations and all the things going on in California. If we do not cover your favorite issue or regulation, please do not hesitate to leave a question in the webinar panel. We'll do our best as we can to answer the question during the webinar or following the event. So I'd like to start with a summary of the 2024 air quality landscape. Of course, we still have Governor Gavin Newsom, who is passing regulation for clean energy and clean air in the state of California and having a lot of influence. We will discuss the new Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act that's been signed into law today. Leon Randolph is the chair of the California Air Resources Board. In the economy, mortgage rates went up quite a bit, but they look like they might be leveling off, and interest rates might be becoming steady. So we'll have to see what happens with the economy, but it's looking pretty good right now. Artificial intelligence, AI, of course, is becoming a bigger topic, and some of us are finding ourselves asking questions in apps like ChatGPT. What's the meaning of life? What will AI do to me in the future? And those kinds of things. But it's interesting to see how AI will become more part of our lives. We're seeing phasing in of regulations we'll talk about today, including the truck regulations and in automobiles. And also take a look at whether charging infrastructure supports that decision, as some of us are trying to take a look at buying electric cars. Environmental justice is an issue in California. We're seeing that much more commonly a part of regulatory decision making with agencies. And you can see here on the bottom left, this is a graphic of one of the areas where there are quite a few disadvantaged communities. So we'll talk a little bit about environmental justice. And what about on the federal level? Well, it appears the Supreme Court is becoming more of a factor as far as how regulations are being interpreted, potentially modifying or overturning past decisions. And I'll talk about that more today, where we have not in the past year. And of course, it's a presidential election year. What does that mean for 2024? No comment, probably not too much, but we'll be looking forward to see what happens in 2025, right? So today we will talk about some federal regulations and policies that affect the state of California. We'll dive into California state regulations, including a legislative update, a summary of ARB activities, talk about the status of emission inventories in the state, discuss the California Environmental Quality Act regulations and technical tools that are being used for that regulation and other regulations, and then go into some air district regulations, including especially the South Coast Air District, San Joaquin District, Bay Area, and San Diego County District. And then we'll follow up with a summary. First, about BlueScape. BlueScape is a company that has been consulting on air quality regulations in California since 1997. We work with a wide range of industries, from power generation, utilities, refineries, sand and gravel, landfills, aerospace, auto manufacturing, and all kinds of other manufacturing companies. As far as air quality services, we specialize in getting air permits to design and maximize operational flexibility and reduce compliance burden, and to help with equipment controls. We specialize in impact analysis, from air emissions to air quality impact analysis with models and health risk assessment. We do CEQA air quality review for land use and industrial projects, and we solve tough air regulation compliance problems. So let's talk about federal regulations and policies in 2024 and the past in 2023 that are affecting California. So I talked last year for the same webinar about the Inflation Reduction and Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that was adopted by the Biden administration. And what I want to do is take a look at where we are now. So now there have been quite a few proposals. There have been quite a few applications for funding. So for example, taking a look at the rural areas, there's a report by the USDA that there was $31 million to clean energy solar panels for farmers, $751 million for powering affordable clean energy. These are forgivable loans that were applied for, and $61 million for rural cooperatives, energy cooperatives. So a lot of money going to rural areas where there's a lot of infrastructure needed. These are, of course, applications, but there's a lot of money in play right now. So as far as those acts go, that is still going on. There's quite a bit of money still out there. So if you're developing energy projects, you may take a look at some of that funding coming in from the federal government. As far as emission standards at the federal level, there was a proposal that came out in April of 2023. That's actually kind of a big deal. This is for light and medium duty vehicles in a phase-in period over 2027 to 2032 as a fleet-based standard, and that means each manufacturer has to meet the standards individually. And it's built on previous standards for greenhouse gas. And it's estimated that by about 2032, 67% of new models will be zero emission vehicles. Most of them, of course, probably electric, maybe some hydrogen vehicles. Well, so what's the big deal in California? Well, really, it's a so what, because in California, under the regulations currently, 35% of new 2026 of new cars sold in 2026 must be zero emissions, 68% in 2030, and 100% in 2035. So while it's a big deal at the federal level, it's going to probably have a pretty big impact. It's not as big a deal in California, where these standards are much more aggressive and have to be met much sooner. Of course, in California, a lot of regulations are passed at times without knowing for sure whether they can be attained. So we're still working on those kinds of details, right, trying to get to that point in California. As far as the proposed federal regulation, though, there were quite a few comments last year. There was recently a letter from 4,700 auto dealers asking Biden to put the brakes on this rule, saying there's no way that this rule can be attained. And so, as far as I understand, it was past the comment period. So we will be looking in 2024 to see if that rule is finalized and have an impact nationally on car standards. For attainment of criteria pollutant standards, the one that we're watching last year and continues to be a watch is for the annual PM 2.5 standard. Proposal was to lower that standard from 12 micrograms per meter cubed down to a level of 9 to 10 micrograms per meter cubed, which is a really big drop if you've ever done any air quality modeling impact analysis. It can be really tough to pass the standard for facilities that are developing, that are doing modeling. So this is something to watch. We really haven't seen as far as a schedule this year to know when it's going to be finalized. I have to feel that EPA is doing a lot of studies on this standard to make sure it can be implemented practically, right, and it's something that is doable, and looking at the health impacts of doing this and other benefits and costs, but it's something to watch for in 2024. And as far as other federal and EPA regulations and policies under federal new source review permitting last year, there was an EPA proposed rule for major to area source reclassification requiring that enforceable limits be put in permits to make sure that that change from a major source of pollution to an area source is something enforceable. What does that mean? Well, that means you have to have some type of limit which you track, which you can make sure you stay in that area source. You can't just say, I want to be an area source. You have to actually have an enforceable limitation of permit. Also, the guideline and air quality models, which we call the GACM, has proposed revisions. I'm going to talk more about those details related to air quality models in a bit. For source-specific standards, new source performance standards and NESHAPs, NSPS, and national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants. I've put the links in here. You do have to go through and take a look at some of the changes. I won't go through all of them. There was one change for NSPS subpart 0000B, final rule language for the oil and gas industry, which includes updating liquids unloading standards to meet best management practices rather than meet zero emissions, so a little bit more flexibility in that standard. There's also a new subpart KC for tanks with volatile petroleum liquids, and proposed amendments to subpart KB, proposing to reduce the volatile pressure applicability thresholds. These are very technical standards, so I'm not going to go through a lot of details, but basically additional monitoring and operating requirements and proposed degassing emission controls and other standards are being implemented into storage tanks. A lot of these are petroleum refineries, oil and gas, chemical plants, and so forth. On the NESHAP, National Emission Standards, and also NSPS for emergency engines, which a lot of people have those, and also gas engines, there were some changes in June 2023 to provide for simplified electronic reporting and to enhance data availability. So EPA has come out with a fiscal budget for 2024. I put the link here, and I took a look at that, and this is a goal budget for 2024 as far as appropriations. And I've noticed that there's a lot of increases in funding proposed for certain areas related to environmental justice, related to clean air, clean water, and so forth. However, even though it's a goal, there still has to be an appropriation. And last year, the EPA budget was cut quite a bit. As you know, there's a more conservative House now with Congress, so it remains to be seen whether the goal appropriation will happen. But if you want to see what EPA is working on as far as budget and programs for the coming year, you can take a look at that link right there. So I do want to talk about the Supreme Court because it seems like the more conservative Supreme Court is clearly willing to review longstanding statutory decisions, agency interpretations, to review what I might call appropriate authority and who should be making decisions on certain regulations and interpretation of regulations. I'm sure all of you heard about Roe versus Wade. This is more of the same happening with environmental regulations. So the first of these is Sackett versus EPA in May of 2023. It was basically somebody that wanted to build a house on a lake, and there was a Clean Water Act issue. And the Clean Water Act saying that you cannot build on these wetlands that are connected to navigable waters. This case challenges that interpretation by EPA, and the decision by the Supreme Court was that it has to be really clear where the two connect. It can't be, you have to make sure that you understand where they connect to make that kind of conclusion. So it basically overturned a longstanding EPA interpretation under the Clean Water Act. Recently, big news with Loper Bright and Relentless versus Department of Commerce, a challenge to Chevron versus NRDC. The Chevron case, they're calling it, is a longstanding, very quoted case that says basically a government agency must conform to clear legislative statements when interpreting and applying a law, but courts will give agency deference in ambiguous situations as long as the interpretation is reasonable. Well, this case had to do with fisheries and boats, and the government was requiring monitors to be put on boats to make sure that fisheries were not overfishing. They would go out and that was being challenged in this case. Well, what the Supreme Court has noted in some of the oral arguments is a leaning towards potentially overturning or modifying this, saying that agencies shouldn't be the ones who are looking at ambiguous regulations. It really should be the courts who are looking at that. And so this could potentially overturn any number of decisions that have been made in the past with regard to regulations. And I imagine there's all kinds of things we can imagine that could happen, things that could be reopened, and things that we can't even think of, can't even imagine. But my understanding of statutes and regulations, they're all pretty much ambiguous. They have a goal, and then you start to work through the process of implementing them, and then you have situations, and then sometimes you have to amend the regulations for those situations. So it seems to me like the question of ambiguous is something that comes up quite a bit. And what this would do is if the court overturned Chevron, is it would put it back to the courts, meaning there could be a lot of things reopened, of course. So this is something really to watch this year. This could have a really big impact. Could it have a trickle-down impact, possibly even to hearing boards with the local air districts, where there's often deference to the agency experts? It's possible. There could be all kinds of impacts like that. So keep watch on this. This is something that should probably be decided by June of this year. And like I said, it does look like the conservative majority is leaning towards overturning or potentially modifying the Chevron decision. Okay, so before we go on to the state regulations, we're going to do a poll. Hang on just a second. Switching my other computer here. Okay, so the question is, what will most impact your operations or your projects you're working on in 2024? You can go ahead and put your answers in. Give people some time here. Is it California air emissions inventory requirements, new or amended EPA, CARB, or air district equipment standards, California Environmental Quality Act regulation, legal challenges to project development, or phase-in of state greenhouse gas or energy regulations? Okay, looks like we had a problem with the poll. So, oh yeah, it was already closed out. Okay, well, sorry about that. Can't do the poll, but take your favorite pick. I'll take your word for it. That's the first time I've ever had a poll that didn't work out. Okay, well, so now we're going to do the California regulatory update for 2024, and I will introduce Peyton Wilson of BlueScape Environmental to give that part of the presentation.
Thank you, James. Are the slides up for the presentation now? It looks like you can still see the poll on your screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hang on just a second.
Oh, looks good.
Yep, great.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for introducing me. My name is Peyton Wilson, and I will be covering regulatory updates in California. You can get the next slide. So first I'm going to talk about new air quality laws passed in 2023 with some extra focus on Senate Bill 253, which is the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. Then I'm going to talk about the status of on-road and off-road emission reduction regulations, just so we know what vehicles and what equipment we are allowed to be operating in 2024. I'll talk about some environmental justice initiatives before I hand it back to James to talk about emissions reporting as well as CEQA updates. Next slide. So these are all new air quality laws passed in 2023. Since these were just passed, we're not going to see all of these kick in for several years, but there are topics to keep your eye on. AB 43 requires CARB to establish a framework for measuring and reducing the average carbon intensity of building materials. So looking forward closer to 2028, we may see more requirements for reporting where your building materials are coming from, and also limits on how carbon intensive those building materials will be. AB 579, this requires all newly purchased government school buses to be zero emission vehicles where feasible starting in 2035. AB 1216 requires wastewater treatment facilities within 1,500 feet of residential areas to install fence line monitoring to measure pollutants such as hydrogen sulfide by 2027. AB 1594, this requires public utilities to purchase zero emission vehicle replacements for traditional utility specialized vehicles that are at the end of their life. We have AB 1305, Senate Bill 253, and 261. These are all bills focused on increasing transparency with corporations' GHG-related activities. So 1305 requires business entities that sell carbon offsets to disclose specified information about those offsets on their website. SB 253, this is a big one. I'm going to talk about it more in a bit, but it establishes new GHG emission reporting program, a new emission reporting program for corporations. And then 261 requires corporations to develop a report on its climate-related financial risks and to make that info publicly available. Next slide. This is the legislative schedule or session for 2024. New bills will be introduced next month in February. They'll be passed out of their House of Origin in May, passed to the legislature in August, and then if they make it that far, the governor signs or vetoes the bills in September. You can track these new bills using the links on this slide. Next slide. So SB 253, this is a law to keep your eye on. It mandates annual GHG reporting for entities with revenues greater than $1 billion starting in 2026. This is a different type of reporting than CTR or TEI. It will be reported to a different type of reporting organization that has yet to be developed. Third-party verification will be mandatory. and non-compliance could result in fines up to $500,000 per year. Next slide. This is a breakdown of the types of GHG emissions that companies will be required to report. There's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and Scope 2 will be required to be reported in 2026, and Scope 3 will be required to be reported in 2027. This visual down here describes what each of these scopes means. Scope 1 emissions means all direct GHG emissions that stem from sources that the business owns or directly controls. So this will include all your on-site sources as well as off-site mobile sources such as company vehicles. Scope 2 emissions means indirect greenhouse gas emissions from consumed electricity, steam, heating, or cooling. So these are public utility-based emissions. And then finally, Scope 3, these are what we would like to call life cycle GHG emissions. So it means indirect upstream and downstream emissions from sources that the business may not own directly or may not control. So this could include the production and transport of materials, both pre and post-production, purchased goods and services, businesses, travel, employee commute. Scope 3 basically includes all the GHG emissions involved in your supply chain. So again, watch out for guidance coming in on this in 2024 and 2025, and be prepared to report in 2026. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the status of the on-road and off-road emission reduction regulations. A lot of types of engines and non-zero emission vehicles are being phased out over the next couple of years. So one of these regulations is Advanced Clean Fleets. This is a large-scale transition to zero emissions vehicles for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. This regulation targets dry-ish trucks, high-priority fleets, as well as government fleets. So the dry-ish trucks include Class 7 and 8 vehicles that transport containers to and from ports and rail yards. Starting in 2024, all newly purchased dry-ish trucks must be zero emission, and all that are operated are required to be zero emission by 2035. However, legacy trucks can continue to operate through their minimum useful life. High priority fleets are also regulated by Advanced Clean Fleets. High priority fleets include fleets owned by companies that have either 50 million in revenue or a total of 50 or more vehicles in their fleets. This chart below here shows the phase out schedule of non-ZEV vehicles. Starting in 2025, if your non-ZEV is at the end of its life, or if the engine model is 18 years old, it must be removed from your fleet. These may only be replaced with ZEVs or near ZEVs, which are hybrids. And then starting in 2035, they can only be ZEVs, so no hybrids, just zero emission electric or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. In 2036, you will no longer be able to purchase non-ZEV medium and heavy duty trucks. Next slide. So this is just a different type of schedule. Fleets have an option of following to phase out their non-ZEVs if you don't want to worry as much about phasing out your old traditional vehicles. So as long as you have a certain percentage of your fleet as ZEV, then you can keep some of your older vehicles. So for example, in 2025, Group 1 fleets do not have to remove all their traditional fueled vehicles at the end of their life, as long as 10% of their fleet is made up of zero emission vehicles. And we'll have these slides available after the presentation if you want to get a closer look at these numbers. Next slide. We also have advanced clean cars. This regulation is the response to Executive Order N7920, which requires all new passenger cars, trucks, and SUVs sold in California to be zero emission or plug-in hybrid cars by 2035. This is a two-pronged regulation, so it requires an increasing percent of vehicles sold in California to be ZEVs. It also requires increasingly stringent emission standards to reduce smog-forming emissions. Next slide. This graph shows the requirement for the percentage of new vehicles sold in California that must be zero emission or hybrids. Currently, 16% of new vehicles sold in California are zero emission or hybrid. And by 2026, that number should be 35% of all cars. Next slide. So getting into the off-road diesel regulation now. CARB is phasing out a lot of lower tier engines in the next couple of years for your off-road fleets. So this includes construction equipment or forklifts or any non-road mobile engine that uses diesel will be impacted by this regulation. This graph shows the phase-out schedule for certain tiers of engines. As you can kind of see, all tier 0, tier 1, and tier 2 engines will be prohibited by 2032. And in the top corner here, you can see for large fleets, tier 0 engines are no longer allowed effective January 1st of this year, and so on and so forth. Next slide. There are also restrictions kicking in for the type of new engines you can add to your fleet in 2024. So starting January 1st this month, only tier 4 final or cleaner engines may be added to large and medium fleets, and then only tier 4 interim or cleaner may be added to small fleets. There's also new renewable diesel requirements kicking in this month. All California fleets are required to procure and use R99 or R100 renewable diesel fuel in off-road vehicles. So R99 or R100 are diesel fuel substitutes produced from non-petroleum renewable sources. There are some exemptions for this fuel requirement if your fleet is in a captive attainment area, or if your entire fleet is made up of tier 4 final engines. There's also cold weather exemptions. Next slide. So getting into some of the California environmental justice related initiatives, in recent years, we have seen tools developed to assess environmental burdens and disproportionately impact communities, and these tools have helped guide EJ regulations. CalEnviroscreen identifies communities disproportionately burdened by multiple sources of pollution and socioeconomic factors. We've also seen upgrades to CalEEMod so that it includes features to help identify climate risks or other contributing risk factors to new developments. And then there is, of course, AB 617, the Community Air Protection Program. Next slide. So the CAP program, key elements of this program have been identification of selected impacted communities, and within those communities, coming up with a community emissions reduction program or a community air monitoring plan, SERPs and CAMPs. These programs are carried out by local air districts and focus on restricting and monitoring those stationary and area sources impacting these selected communities. There are several statewide emission reduction measures, which I will talk about after this slide. There's expedited best available retrofit technology. This is rulemaking targeting industries impacting these communities and requires more stringency on the amount that you have to control your emissions in these communities. There's also many statewide transparency tools and partnerships that you can check out on the ARB website. A lot of the information on these facilities is becoming publicly available online through programs like the CTR program, which I know James will talk about in a second here. Next slide. So these are just the 19 selected CAP communities as of 2022, in which you will see these programs target. There's lots of portside communities or areas in heavy industrial or disadvantaged areas. Next slide. So these are some of CARB's recent and upcoming regulations intended to reduce those emissions of air toxics and criteria pollutants in the selected communities, as well as statewide. Advanced clean trucks, this requires a certain amount of trucks manufactured to be zero emission vehicles. Cargo handling equipment. In 2028, CARB will consider transitioning all mobile equipment at ports and rail yards to zero emission vehicles to reduce pollution impacts to portside communities. Chrome plating control measure amendments, this has been a big one. It completely phases out hexavalent chromium plating. Starting January 1st, starting this month, there are no new hexavalent chrome plating facilities prohibited. We have heavy duty engine and vehicle omnibus regulation. This increases the stringency of NOx emission standards with the more stringent standards beginning in 2024 model year engines. And then we have the zero emission forklift regulation. This is a regulatory proposal being developed to accelerate the transition of propane and gasoline forklifts to zero emission technology starting in 2026. So those are some things to watch out for. And I will hand it off to James to talk about other California regulations and CTR.
Thank you, Peyton, very much. Yeah, so the air emissions reporting universe got very busy last year with the CTR phase-in 2022 emissions in 2023 of a number of facilities. So the air emissions reporting universe includes the emissions inventory criterion guidelines, call that the AB 2588 regulation, which has been around since 1987, but did recently, it was updated to capture a lot more of the smaller facilities that had much more toxic emissions. Threshold was lowered. And of course, the CTR regulation has been phasing in now over a number of years, and I'll talk about how that's been going forward. In addition to air district or EPA emissions programs that have existed, these programs are working together. But really, it's the CTR regulation and AB 2588 that is driving a lot of the emission inventory activity in the state currently. These are tables that come from the CTR regulation from ARB. On the top, you can see what I call core facilities that have to report every year. These are the much bigger facilities. They have to do greenhouse gas mandatory reporting. They have very large criteria pollutant emissions, that would be NOx, VOC, particulate, and so forth. Or they're an elevated toxics facility that's been designated by an air district as having much more toxic emissions. Maybe they do the health risk assessment, or they have emissions that are scored higher for health risk. So these are core facilities that have had to report since 2022 data year and have to report every single year. And then we have what happened last year was the phase-in of the additional applicability facilities, starting with District Group A. That's the 6 biggest air districts with most facilities in California, as shown here, had to do phase 1 reporting. So any facilities over 4 tons per year and the phase 1 facilities had to do reporting. And what really captured a lot of the facilities was the fact that diesel engines are a phase 1 equipment type at these facilities. Unless you had a very low use diesel engine, you probably got caught in these 6 air districts in Group A with reporting in 2023. Well, as you can see from the bottom chart, there's actually 3 years of gap for phase 1. Not until 2026 data year do those facilities have to report again. But we now have phase 2 reporting next year for 2024 emissions. So you should take a look at the CARB regulation. Phase 2 does include a number of types of facilities. So I don't think the wave of additional applicability facilities is going to be as big, but phase 2 is reporting for data year 2024 next year. That means you have to be ready by having all your records for reporting. Also, for District Group B, which is all the other air districts, for those more than 10 tons per year with phase 1, again, this is going to be a lot of facilities with maybe just one diesel engine that's permitted are going to be pulled in. So that outside of the 6 air districts will bring a lot more facilities in next year for reporting in 2024. So CTR combined with the AB 2588 toxics regulation, if you have air toxic emissions, diesel engines, if you have chromium plating, welding, because some districts require permitted and non-permitted emissions, you want to consider really taking a look at refining your emissions, doing a really good job of what you're reporting. If you're reporting an emissions inventory, or if like in San Diego, you're reporting emission statements with information, just to be sure that you have really taken a look to make sure your records are as accurate as possible, maybe not too conservative, because once you submit that information or that inventory, it could lead to air toxic risk scores and possibly health risk assessment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act update. In the past year, there really hasn't been any update in the state CEQA guidelines. The state CEQA guidelines are the complement to the statute that really implements CEQA. However, the Bay Area District did come out with CEQA guidelines that really are for that area, but also has a section regarding greenhouse gas. And other areas of the state have been looking at these guidelines because they were developed without regard to a numerical greenhouse gas threshold. In that guideline, Bay Area District guideline, section 3.2 or table 3.2, you have a couple different options. You can do a project-specific analysis of greenhouse gas where you have to take into account mitigation into your project that meets the state scoping plan for greenhouse gas and generally meets the requirements to reduce greenhouse gas within the state. That might include, well, at least used to include, we'll talk about this in a second with the Berkeley natural gas, getting rid of all natural gas in buildings, lowering vehicle miles traveled, meeting the CalGreen Tier 2 standards and so forth. Or the other option is if there is some type of local agency, lead agency plan where you can meet that plan, you could opt to meet with that. But neither one deals with numeric thresholds. These are ways to show that the project is not significant under CEQA following these types of guidelines. So I have seen other lead agencies adopt this type of approach as far as these kinds of things to show that impacts are not significant. Greenhouse gas and mitigation around greenhouse gas continues to be the more difficult topic when it comes to air quality development projects in California under CEQA, more so than the air quality modeling, air quality impact analysis, which generally is consistent with state practice, although health risk assessment impacts can be a big topic under CEQA as well. And that gets us to the South Coast AQ&D cumulative health risk impacts. There has been a working group working on developing a process for reviewing cumulative health risk impacts. As you probably know, the CEQA regulation does require applicants and lead agencies to look at cumulatively considerable impacts, but most agencies have not really been looking at that so much from the standpoint of health risk impact. And there are areas like the Inland Empire where there's a lot of concern about a lot of development going on and how those impacts might combine together to reach a really high cumulative impact. So the South Coast District has been looking at that question along with updating all of their guidance and have been considering looking at a kind of a tier process of, is this project expected to have cumulative impacts, more of a qualitative review, leading into a more of a quantitative review, and then evaluating all different kinds of ways of considering the significance of the impact. And one of those that's very important is to consider, like we have in the Inland Empire, is the project within an area where there's a disadvantaged community, looking at the CalEnviroscreen score and trying to determine if that is a factor, and then possibly lowering risk thresholds for cumulative risk analysis in that. So there's a lot of detail around that. There has not been scheduled another working group meeting yet, but that will probably continue to be developed into 2024. The Berkeley natural gas ordinance case is important because, as I mentioned, as far as the CEQA regulation, scoping plan, the Bay Area guidelines, the trend has been to work towards decarbonization, reducing carbon in buildings, and one of those ways is to reduce and eliminate natural gas combustion, which is a greenhouse gas source within new buildings and even existing buildings potentially. Well, the Berkeley ordinance from 2019 did ban natural gas in new buildings, and this particular ordinance was challenged by the California Restaurant Association on the basis of overstepping authority as a preemption of the Federal Energy and Policy Conservation Act. So basically this was overturned. This ordinance was overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and so the case, of course, was pending another appeal. Well, it turns out that a federal court is not going to take up that appeal, and the only other court that can do it is the US Supreme Court. Well, is the US Supreme Court likely to take up a case that the lower court clearly says tries to preempt a federal law? Most likely not. So there are other jurisdictions like Encinitas and other cities and counties that have been looking at these bans or have bans on the books, and they're stepping back because of the concern that that there could be lawsuits that could come from trying to enforce that type of ordinance. So that's something to understand if you're looking at those local regulations. I have seen projects consider the you know, if it's a good idea, let's reduce natural gas or find some way to go to electric appliances and try to do these things that we're trying to do for climate change in California, but not necessarily as a hard requirement. I want to talk about one recent project case, the East Oakland Stadium Alliance versus City of Oakland. This is in a Court of Appeals case. This was one where the court heard a contention that the EIR program improperly deferred mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but rejected that on the basis that state law already required emission reduction measures for the City of Oakland. Another one was that the applicant had used assumption of 50 hours per year for backup generators, which is a standard maximum amount of hours for backup diesel engines. The other side contended that there was a need to look at 100 hours, but the court decided that that was a reasonable approach to use the 50 hours and rejected that contention as well. One interesting thing, though, that the court did say was that, and this sort of is an air quality impact, that the wind impacts from building a stadium had not been properly reviewed, specifically reviewed. There was a goal to review them and to potentially mitigate if needed, but the court said you can't improperly defer the need for mitigation based upon a goal, that you have to set specific standards for what mitigation would be. In other words, you have to do your wind analysis so you know that you have a problem that you may have to mitigate. So the court didn't like the fact that that was put off, improperly deferred. Okay, so as far as technical tools for all of those who use these tools or know those who do in consulting and modeling and so forth, Peyton did mention CalEEMod. There is a web tool now, which is, I think a lot of people are finding it easier to use. However, there have been a lot of revisions, and so you can rapidly update this very easily, but there have been a lot of revisions to the tool. There have been bug fixes and so forth, so we now have 2022.1121 out there for CalEEMod. This is the most often used tool for calculating emissions. Other than using spreadsheet calculations, a lot of agencies do like to use the CalEEMod tool. As far as mobile source inventory tools, we still have MFAC 2021 is the EPA approved version. There is a workshop coming, actually just happened, sorry, on MFAC for 2025. That would be the version for MFAC 2025 that would adopt new emission factors and also projections for emission factors in the future. So if you're using CalEEMod, you have an older version of MFAC built in. As Peyton was talking about, there's a lot of phase-in of regulations, and CalEEMod may not include the emission reductions based upon the older MFAC as things go forward. So you want to keep that in mind, because you might be able to adjust emission factors within CalEEMod or do calculations outside the database to account for projects that are starting later, maybe have multi-phases going forward. Just keep in mind that if you use MFAC 2021 or CalEEMod data, you're going to be probably pretty conservative. Also, the offroad 2021 database is going to have blended fleet emission factors for diesel particulate and other emissions, and may be very conservative as things are trending towards cleaner, tier 4 off-road for particulate and so forth emissions based on AERB standards. The AERMOD dispersion model, which is the go-to for air quality modeling, is now at version 23132. That's a version that honors the father of AERMOD, Roger Brode, a palindrome. He liked to use those in his models. The most recent version has bug fixes for different kinds of sources. There's an update to the R-line model, which is used in transportation modeling. And there's a new beta GRSM Tier 3 NOx screening tool. As you probably know, alpha is a term for techniques in AERMOD that are being rolled out to try, but beta is something which is beyond that, and you could potentially use if you're doing Tier 3 NOx screening. Also, there's an alpha option for high buoyant plumes, plume meander for area sources, and for plume rise from aircraft. And a lot of these changes in AERMOD proposals that are going in now are in the proposed rule I mentioned for the guideline air quality models. But if it's something specific as how to use AERMOD, you want to look at the AERMOD implementation guide. Always take a look at that if you have a question on how to implement certain features of AERMOD. That's the place to go. There is a version updated October 2023. As far as air toxics health risk assessment, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and CARB put out a list of the consolidated health risk assessment values. The most recent version is October 6, 2023. There have been a few chemicals that have come out since 2022. Trivalent chromium is one that might come up quite a bit more now. It is a fairly toxic compound, about half as toxic as arsenic. 1-bromopropane was a new one, and trimethylbenzenes. So a few changes in pollutants have come on the list there. If you want to know what the most updated values are, take a look at that list. And then the tool for doing health risk assessment, the HARP2 or Hotspots Analysis and Reporting Program, has been updated for those pollutant changes, and the most recent health database is the same date, whereas the HARP2 version, the most recent version of the modeling tools, is from 2022. There haven't been any major updates. All right, so now I'm going to talk about air district regulations, focusing on a few air districts here. For the South Coast Air District, first looking at the rules adopted in 2023. Quite a few rules here. I put the adoption date next to it. In December 2023, the ethylene oxide rule was updated to substantially reduce emissions to up to 100% for stacks and fugitive emissions. Ethylene oxide has been a big issue in the basin. However, I think this only affects about 15 facilities, but it is something to take a look at as far as the kinds of regulations that the Air District is passing for toxic compounds. Rule 1110.3 is for emissions from linear generators. These are a generator that moves in a linear fashion with a coil and a magnet, and this regards natural gas combustion to fuel these generators, which could be seen potentially in the future as a replacement of your standard internal combustion engines that also use diesel, because natural gas, of course, cleaner. But these are emission standards that are being adopted because the district sees that possibility and wants to be sure we have a regulation for that. So it also amends 1110.2 for changes with the linear generators. Rule 111111 for reduction of emissions from natural gas-fired fan-type central furnaces affects furnaces less than 175,000 BTU per hour, or combo heating cooling units less than 65,000 BTU per hour, reducing NOx emissions for those kinds of units. Rule 1153.1, emissions of oxides from commercial food ovens, reductions based upon a BART assessment. Peyton was talking about the BARCT, Best Available Retrofit Control Technology. The air districts have been adopting BART under AB 617 for different types of sources. Commercial food ovens is one where there was a BART assessment. The emission reductions for this rule affect 97 facilities and about 218 ovens, mostly larger commercial ovens, but does have a pretty big impact on those facilities. Rule 219 and 22 is an important regulation for determining whether you need to have an air permit. So there was a revision of Rule 219 and the other rule that's associated with that for registration 222. And most of this was for clarity in the regulations, to clarify some of the exemptions to be consistent with federal regulations in some cases, such as with equipment replacement. There weren't any major changes as there were previous times for Rule 219, but that was adopted. Rule 1401.1, requirements for newer relocated facilities near schools, expanded an important definition for school, where schools were typically seen as being kindergarten through 12th grade in California regulations and district in the past. Now looking at Head Start programs, early learning, where children may be closer to facilities more of the time, not necessarily daycares, but places where they're going to be a lot more for learning at that early age, where they're much more sensitive to the health impacts from pollution. So that was an important update for 1401.1. As far as the WARE rule, the warehouses rule, the phase 1 and 2 facilities are required to submit annual reports by tomorrow. So the larger facilities, the phase 1 would be greater than or equal to 250,000 square feet. Phase 2 is between 150,000 and 250,000 square feet. So that WARE program for warehouses is continuing. to be implemented, and I understand enforcement started last year as well. What's happening with the reclaim program? That's a good question. From what I understand, most of the what they call the landing rules by equipment have already been adopted, so that industries and equipment has been regulated into these landing rules out of reclaim. Now we're just waiting for the South Coast District and EPA to work on questions related to new source review, the emission credits, how to finally transition reclaim to go away. There's still no status on that, but I would keep tracking that because that will be an important change. But I think for most companies, because of the landing rules, the impact of the reclaim program is probably going to be more, minimal, even if you still are on the reclaim program. For 2024, here's a list of the proposed and amended rules, quite a few of them. One thing to point out here is on the right-hand side, I've shown you where a rule is going to a public workshop, which is a much more, getting closer to the end stage, or public hearing, where it might be going to the governing board for adoption soon. For public hearing, we have the rule 461.1 for gasoline transfer and dispensing. It's supposed to go to public hearing February 2nd, 2024. This is to get an exemption for aviation gasoline. We also have a couple rules in the middle here: emissions from refinery flares, control of NOx from large water heaters, small boilers, and process heaters going to public workshop. The one with the NOx from large water heaters, that's a pretty big impact potentially on facilities. It seeks up to 8 tons per day of NOx emission reductions and will affect about 773,000 units, according to the South Coast District, including existing equipment. So over time, what we're seeing is that the district is requiring retrofits of older equipment, certification of equipment, and so forth, and that is continuing with this particular rule. So I would take a look at that one because this does affect a number of facilities and a lot of equipment. Rule 1148.1 is a regulation that is being considered for adoption, has a public workshop coming up quite soon here this week. 1148.1 applies to 330 oil and gas facilities to reduce VOC emissions at wellheads and control produced gas emissions. Also establishes work practice and odor mitigation procedures. Odor has been a big issue for a lot of these facilities, and so they're working on those types of things. As far as the rules in working groups, you can see which ones are further along. On the bottom, you have the metal heat treating and laser and plasma arc cutting. These are toxics regulations that are focusing on hexavalent chromium, nickel, in these types of operations. And these have been on the books for a while, but they're still going forward under the working groups. But one to really watch for coming up, there is no schedule right now. They almost had a work group meeting that was canceled. But the control of toxic air contaminants from torch cutting and welding. There are types of welding that have hexavalent chromium, nickel in them, and district is aware of this. There is regulation in other parts of the state, like in San Diego, involving welding rods, and so they will be taking a look at that question like they are for laser and plasma arc cutting. I'd recommend taking a look at the 2024 rule and control measure forecast to see what the district is working on and what their goals are for the year. That comes out with every governing board meeting, the last one being the 5th of January, 2024. There is a BACT, Best Available Control Technology Guidelines public hearing. I'd recommend taking a look at that coming up February 2nd. The BACT guidelines are being revised and they are used in the permitting process, very important for determining what types of emission control should be put on new equipment under the new source review regulations. All right, just a few minutes left. I'm going to talk about San Joaquin Valley here. As far as attainment planning, we have the 2022 ozone plan that was adopted. There's been no updates on that since December 2022. There was a hearing on the 2023 plan for the 2012 annual PM2.5 standard. There was a 2018 plan already adopted, so there are hearings now to look at updating the plans for attainment with the annual PM2.5 standard. Rules adopted in 2023, there are a number related to oil and gas fields and transfer of organic liquids. These are rules that have not been updated for some time. Also a rule for wood burning fireplaces and heaters, Rule 4901 and Rule 2201. In development in 2024 for the San Joaquin District, we have the federal mandated operating permits, Rule 2520, that will remove the affirmative defense provision consistent with EPA actions. Conservation management practices, Rule 4550, and commercial charbroiling, Rule 4692. So the first one's for agriculture, and for restaurants with charbroiling, these are rules that are focusing on commitments under the 2018 PM 2.5 attainment plan. The most recent guidance document for best available control technology came out in 2023. That was an update, and the next board meeting for San Joaquin District is coming up on the 15th of February. In the Bay Area District, we have amendments that have happened recently to Reg 8, Rule 8 for wastewater collection and separation, implementing emission limits and amending leak detection programs. For proposed Reg 11, Rule 18 amendments, that rule has been adopted to implement a lot of the provisions of the AB 2588 program I've talked about earlier. So as far as air toxic emissions and how that's being implemented and phased in that regulation, there is a public workshop coming up in February 15th that will take a look at some concepts for that, and that's going to be an important thing to consider if you're one of those facilities on the list for regulation under Reg 11, Rule 18. We also have proposed Reg 8, Rule 18 amendments for equipment leaks that is being reviewed right now at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. In San Diego, last year we talked about the new governing board, big change for the governing board, a lot of things going on with changes at San Diego Air District. There was adoption of the regional air quality strategy in March of 2023, where you can read a lot about the plans that the district has for attaining standards. A big change, a big issue that came up, a big decision that came up for this air district was to go severe non-attainment for ozone. The Title V Rule 1410 becomes effective February 27th, 2024. So there have been about 15 facilities that were required by December 2023 to file an amendment, a final application for amending their permits so that they can either be a synthetic miner or become a Title V facility. So there were a number of facilities that had to go into that program because of this reclassification to severe non-attainment. There's also the Rule 19.2 for continuous emissions monitoring. If you have one of those, you should be looking at that rule and reviewing, making comments potentially. And also the San Diego District revised the MACT Standards in November 2023 after about 12 years of not having a revision. So that was a significant update. All right, so to summarize, Biden and the EPA have been going deep on clean energy with a lot of programs to fund changes in climate change, new regulations, and to have clean air. I feel that the Supreme Court is going to have a greater impact in 2024 and going forward regarding interpretation of regulations and the role of courts. Clean air implementation progress, as Peyton has discussed, is going forward with phasing in of clean air regulations in transportation and other industrial sectors. Environmental justice and community involvement has been picking up over the last few years, has become very important in regulatory rulemaking and interpretation. The CTR, emissions inventory regulation phase-in continues with the additional applicability facilities having to report in next year for 2024 emissions. We'll be watching the new Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act regulations develop and see what happens with reporting under those regulations. And of course, all eyes are on the 2024 election to see what happens in this year, in the coming year in 2025. So that's it for now. We're right at 11. We're going to see if we can take a couple questions. You should definitely put your questions in the panel if you have not already. And Peyton, if you want to come back online, we'll take a couple questions.
Okay, it looks like we have one question in the chat. Are we going to receive a copy of slides and recording later on? Yes, we will post the slides later on, send them in an email, so you will receive all the links and the information.
Okay. So Peyton, a question for you on SB 253. Do you have any visibility on when the regulations are going to be developed, or do you have any? What's the status on that?
They're required to be developed in 2025. So the regulation requires CARP to set up the entire regulation. So we should get more information of that at least, probably this year.
Okay. Another question for you. do you have to report, you have to get a request letter to be required to report?
Oh, for CTR and CEI. No, so the air districts usually do their best to determine if you are required to report for CTR, CEI, or CEI, but ultimately it is up to you to know that you have to report. You have to read the regulation yourself because the air districts, they can't capture everything usually, but for the most part, people do get letters, but it is on you at the end of the day.
Okay. Next question, can you give me an example of an enforceable condition as applied to an area source NESHAP? Yeah, so an enforceable condition, EPA likes to see something which is practically enforceable. They want something that can be monitored. So you're looking at something like a gas limitation. If you have a gas equipment, a boiler, for example, maybe it's in the BTU per month or per year. Will typically have to be done on a 12-month rolling basis. So those are the kinds of things you have to think about for your operation that tie back to whether you're under 10 tons per year of a hazardous air pollutant or 25 of all hazardous. Yeah, well, I mentioned one of them. I felt like the cumulative health risk assessment, the work group in South Coast, is a result of looking at that combined impact of projects. CalEEMod, we have, of course, CalEnviroscreen, and there's consideration of environmental justice impacts in CEQA projects. In some air districts, the Bay Area district, they did lower the health risk threshold for review, for permit review in disadvantaged areas. I don't remember the regulation on that one, but that's something I think the air districts are considering, facilities near schools, but also as we're looking at environmental justice areas, there may be lower impact thresholds for health risk for new permits, and that. Okay. So question on natural gas ordinances. If they're not being enforced, how should projects proceed? I can take that one. So I think the answer is that you want to design a project which has meets everything that you're required to do. But in California, I think that you also have a responsibility to consider alternatives that are feasible to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, impacts in the community. And so that's just, as far as an overall good project design, you might consider going ahead with all natural gas, all known natural gas. Agency plan if you're not consistent with something that you need to do as far as greenhouse gas, and of course you'll have to mitigate emissions and show how you'll do that. But as far as natural gas right now, you might consider the options. You don't necessarily have to remove natural gas from your project, but you might consider the options just in case the Supreme Court goes the other direction, which we don't think is likely. So I think we're a little bit over the hour here. Peyton, any other questions?
I'm not seeing any others in the chat.
Okay. All right. Well, I think because we're over the time here, we'll call it for today. Want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can follow up with us. Here's my contact information.